surgical metabolism and nutrition. The main source of the lecture is the latest edition of Swartz, Principles of Surgery. The learning objectives: at the end of the session, the student must be able to discuss the surgical metabolism, particularly metabolism during fasting and metabolism after injury or sepsis, the consequence of malnutrition in surgical patients, nutritional screening and assessment, fundamental of nutritional support, rationale for enteral nutrition, including the different types of enteral formulas and different access for enteral nutritional support, and the rationale, types, and complications of parenteral nutrition. Immediately after major surgery or traumatic injury, our body compensates metabolically by decreasing the total body energy expenditure and urinary nitrogen wasting. Following trauma or severe injury, usually during the initial management with adequate resuscitation and stabilization of the patient, there will be prioritization of substrate to preserve vital organ functions as well as support repair of injured tissues. And to restore homeostasis, the recovery phase is embodied by functions such as augmented metabolic rates and oxygen consumption, enzymatic preference for readily oxidizable substrates such as glucose, and stimulation of the immune system. The standard to which metabolic alterations after acute severe injury or trauma and critical illness such as sepsis are compared is the fuel metabolism during unstressed fasting states. To maintain basal metabolic needs, particularly during fasting or at rest, approximately 25 to 30 kilocalories per kilogram per day drawn from carbohydrate, lipid, and protein sources is required for normal healthy adult. But this requirement can substantially increase during severe stress states, such as those seen in patients with severe trauma, like in massively burned patients having the highest energy demands. The primary sources of fuel during short-term fasting in healthy adults, meaning fasting of less than 5 days, are obtained from muscle protein and body fat, with fat being the most abundant source of energy. For carbohydrates, the normal adult body has about 300 to 400 grams in the form of glycogen, 75 grams of which are stored in the liver, and the rest of glycogen, about 200 to 250 grams, are stored within the skeletal, cardiac, and smooth muscle cells. However, the greater glycogen stores within the muscle are not readily available for systemic use due to a deficiency in enzyme glucose 6 phosphatase, but are available for the energy needs of muscle cells. As a result, during fasting state, hepatic glycogen stores are rapidly and eventually used up, which consequently result in significant decrease on serum glucose concentration. During fasting, a healthy 70 kilogram adult will utilize 180 grams of glucose per day to support the metabolism of obligate glycolytic cells such as RBC, WBC, neurons, the renal medulla, and the skeletal muscle. During fasting, hormones, particularly glucagon, norepinephrine, vasopressin, and angiotensin II, can promote the utilization of glycogen stores to be converted to glucose. Glucagon, as well as epinephrine and cortisol, can also produce glucose through gluconeogenesis. Amino acids such as alanine and glutamine, glycerol being the backbone of fatty acids and fats, and lactate, which is released by glycolysis within the RBC, WBC, neurons, or within skeletal muscle, are the precursors for hepatic gluconeogenesis. The recycling of lactate and pyruvate for gluconeogenesis is commonly referred to as the Cori cycle, which can provide up to 40% of plasma glucose during starvation. Lactate production from skeletal muscle is not enough to maintain systemic glucose needs during simple starvation or short-term fasting. Consequently, significant amounts of protein must be degraded daily to provide the amino acid substrate for hepatic gluconeogenesis. Proteolysis during starvation, which results primarily from decreased insulin and increased cortisol release, is associated with elevated urinary nitrogen excretion from the normal of about 10 grams per day up to 30 grams or even more per day. In prolonged starvation, systemic proteolysis is reduced to approximately 20 grams per day, and urinary nitrogen excretion stabilizes at 2 to 5 grams per day, which reflects the adaptation by vital organs to using ketone bodies as their principal fuel source. In fact, ketone bodies become an important fuel source for the brain after 2 days and eventually become the main fuel source by 24 days. Lipid stores within the adipose tissue provides 40% or more of caloric expenditure during starvation. Energy requirements for basal enzymatic and muscular functions like neural transmission and cardiac contraction are met by the mobilization of triglycerides from the adipose tissue. What is important is the mobilization of lipid stores for energy decreases the rate of glycolysis, gluconeogenesis, and proteolysis, as well as the overall glucose requirement to sustain the host. In general, fasting in healthy individuals is not much of a problem, as our body adapts to this fasting state by reducing our metabolic rate and activate different metabolic pathways to spare lean body mass. But as doctors, we frequently have our patients fast, such as when the patient is being prepared for a diagnostic evaluation or prior to anesthesia and surgery. But a lot of them, because of their underlying disease, their metabolic rate does not decline, and they cannot adapt to spare protein nor use other sources of calories. For example, this elderly female has severe malnutrition, which is defined as more than 20% weight loss in less than 3 months. The laboratory workups that determine the nutritional status is very, very low due to long-standing gastric outlet obstruction secondary to cancer. It is important for the surgical team as part of the preparation of patient prior to a formidable surgery to optimize or upbuild the nutritional status of the patient. Injuries or infections or surgery produce distinct neuroendocrine and immunologic responses that differentiate metabolism after injury from that of the unstressed fasting, as we had discussed a while ago. And during stress states, lipid becomes the primary source of energy. If the patient will be subjected to stress, such as injury, surgery, or sepsis, the magnitude of metabolic expenditure over time appear to be directly proportional to the severity of insult. The gray normal range is the resting energy expenditure. As you can see, the first few days are not associated with hypermetabolic states, but 2 weeks after, the total energy expenditure increases dramatically, with major burns and sepsis having the highest energy demands. In patients who incurred severe injury or sepsis or underwent major operations, postponing nutrition therapy can lead to malnutrition and its associated higher rates of complications, even mortality, largely due to increased wound infection rates and impaired wound healing. As I emphasized, prior to any elective surgery, we need to identify the nutritional status of the patient. And if the patient has associated malnutrition, we must correct or upbuild the nutritional status of the patient prior to surgery. However, this patient underwent major colon surgery due to obstructing colon cancer. Although preoperatively, we identified the patient to be malnourished, in emergency cases such as this, having complete intestinal obstruction, in some patients with massive bleeding, or in some patients with peritonitis due to perforated bowel, we need to do the surgery immediately, and we have no time to correct the underlying malnutrition. The midline wound of the patient broke down 8 days after surgery because of poor wound healing associated with malnutrition and probably aside from other contributory factors such as chronic steroid use for this patient. This is the wound of the patient after 1 month. It's still not completely healed. Undernutrition or protein energy malnutrition has 2 forms. Kwashiorkor is generally a consequence of acute injury or sepsis, or in some cases following major surgery. The energy and protein needs increase rapidly and are independent of the nutritional state. The stress hormones increase, which produce a hypermetabolic state. Example in the picture is a previously healthy patient who underwent multiple bowel resections due to a gunshot wound. However, 1 week after surgery, the wound broke down due to intra-abdominal infection, secondary to failure of intestinal anastomosis, requiring another surgery for the patient. If the surgical team is not mindful about the nutrition of the patient, acute malnutrition will likely develop. Marasmus is a consequence of reducing nutrient intake over an extended period of time. In short, inadequate intake of otherwise balanced diet. The body undergoes progressive adaptation with a consequent decrease in metabolism in order to protect energy and protein stores. In adult, this is manifested as cachexia. So in marasmus, there is impaired delivery. The protein catabolism is compensated. Etiology is usually no food, no appetite, or there might be intestinal obstruction, short bowel, inflamed or fistulated bowel. The metabolic rate is either normal or reduced, and the prognosis, if untreated, will be for months. The principle of treatment is to replenish with standard nutrition and use the simplest available route. And if there is any underlying illness, it must be treated. While for kwashiorkor, there is impaired utilization and the protein catabolism is uncompensated. The usual etiologies, sepsis, major trauma, burn patients, the metabolic rate is usually increased. The prognosis, if untreated, will be about weeks. And the principle of treatment, resuscitate and support, control the sepsis, and we provide non-standard nutritional regimens. Mixed malnutrition is represented by the patient who has symptoms of chronic malnutrition and are aggravated by a stress event. Some call this as polydeficient malnutrition. While most define malnutrition as persistent shortage or malabsorption of important nutrients that are normally acquired through a balanced diet, being overweight and obesity is also a form of malnutrition which can lead to higher risk of diet-related diseases such as heart disease, stroke, diabetes, and some malignancies. Until the landmark publication of Dr. Charles Butterworth in 1974, it was not generally known that malnutrition could also be found in many modern hospitals in developed countries. In his report, it was stated that even important parameters such as height and weight were not even recorded in many cases, and weight loss, serum albumin levels were not reported, and neglect of nutritional supplementation were alarmingly common. In fact, numerous studies of hospital malnutrition have been conducted since then, and the results strongly indicate that even up to 50% of admitted patients may show some evidence of malnutrition, and that nutritional state worsens with length of hospital stay. Malnutrition and its complications are common, but often unrecognized in surgical patients. In fact, approximately 5% of patients coming to surgery are severely malnourished, and malnutrition is present to varying degrees in up to 50% of patients who undergone surgery. In a patient with metabolic stress and adequate nutrition has not been given, the body will use its protein stores to supply energy requirements. This will cause a decrease in body mass, a delay in wound healing, compromise in immune function, and increase in complication, consequently resulting in increased length of hospitalization and treatment costs. The goal of nutritional support in the surgical patient is to prevent or reverse the catabolic effects of disease or injury. And the ultimate validation for nutritional support should be improvement in clinical outcome and restoration of function. The first critical step in providing appropriate nutrition therapy is to perform nutritional screening and nutritional assessment to identify those patients at risk for nutritional problems. Hence, we may be able to reduce complications, treatment failures, physiological problems associated with malnutrition, as well as lower the hospitalization cost. I would like to emphasize that the diagnosis of nutritional status cannot be made by observation alone. This is a patient with chronic malnutrition due to obvious loss of subcutaneous fat and muscle mass. But even with evidence such as this, it is important to conduct a clinical interview and thorough physical exam to make an accurate nutritional diagnosis. And although this patient does not appear to be malnourished, but based on the clinical data obtained, he was still diagnosed with severe malnutrition. Nutritional screening is the process used to identify the characteristics known to be associated with nutritional problems. The purpose of screening is to identify patients who are at risk for nutritional deficiencies and the subsequent problems related to these deficiencies. Screening tools can be quite simple and quick to administer. It may be incorporated during history taking or as written survey asking the following questions. Does the patient has involuntary increase or decrease in weight of 10% or more of the usual weight over 6 months, or 5% or more of the usual weight over 1 month? Another question is the quality of oral intake and the type of diet the patient had been consuming the past several days or weeks. We may be able to get in the history that the patient has loss of appetite, eating significantly less volume than before, able to tolerate soft diet, or worse, liquid diet only, and other important information regarding nutrition. Nutritional assessment, on the other hand, is the process of collecting and assessing data about the clinical conditions, diet, body composition, and biochemical data in order to identify patients with poor nutritional status, determine the severity of nutrient deficiencies or excess, so we can develop an appropriate nutrition therapy plan. Ideally, all three components should be evaluated during nutritional assessment before malnutrition is diagnosed. Body composition parameters are often measured by anthropometric techniques. Among the most common are the weight and height, and we compute for the BMI. We also assess the skin fold thickness so that prediction of the total amount of body fat can be made based on the premise that the thickness of skin fold is a measure for subcutaneous fat, as the body fat is equally distributed over the body. Of all the skin fold measurements, the triceps skin fold is the most reliable because edema is not common in the upper arm. We also measure the mid-arm muscle circumference and mid-arm muscle area. Several biochemical parameters should also be assessed. Serum albumin values below 3.5 grams per deciliter indicate risk of malnutrition. Other parameters such as TLC, transferrin, prealbumin, cholesterol, TIBC, and creatinine excretion may also be used to substantiate the clinical evaluation of the patient. And for clinical assessment, SGA is the usual assessment tool we use, which can predict which patients are at increased risk for developing malnutrition-associated complications, such as wound infection or poor wound healing. SGA elicits information on the following: weight changes, changes in dietary intake, gastrointestinal symptoms, functional capacity, link between disease and nutritional requirements, and physical exam, which focus on nutritional aspects. Weight changes over the last 6 months is recorded, and the percentage of the changes is calculated. Changes in weight over the last 2 weeks are also recorded. This is important to identify chronic and or acute losses. We also evaluate information on the dietary intake, including the type of diet the patient is consuming, with special emphasis on recent changes in intake. Gastrointestinal symptoms are also noted because they can obviously have an impact on nutritional status, especially if they persist for more than 15 days. These symptoms include nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, loss of appetite. We also record whether or not the patient has a decline in functional capacity, and if so, the duration and type. And the last, in the clinical assessment, we identify the patient's primary diagnosis and indicates what kind of nutritional impact the disease or condition or the surgery is likely to have on the patient. This is a review I had simplified. The normal journey of our enteral nutrition through the digestive system is ingestion of food through the mouth, chewing mechanically, mixes food with saliva and enzymes. With swallowing reflex, the bolus of food is pushed back towards the esophagus down to the stomach through peristalsis. Food is digested in the stomach to chyme with the aid of gastric juices and strong muscular contractions. Then the chyme is slowly emptied into the duodenum for further digestion as it mixes with secretions from the pancreas and gallbladder. Majority of the absorption of nutrients will be through the villi and microvilli of the small intestines. Undigested remains of food will remain to the large intestine for fermentation, creating and storing stools temporarily until mass movement empties, pushes the stool into the rectum. Patients may develop disease that may affect anywhere from the oral cavity up to the esophagus that may cause significant problems with ingestion, swallowing reflex, or passage of food into the esophagus. One example is an esophageal obstruction due to tumor. We can still provide adequate enteral nutrition to these patients by inserting nasogastric tube if possible, or placing feeding tube into the stomach or jejunum if definitive surgery is not feasible. If the disease, particularly in the stomach or duodenum, will affect the digestion, such as in this picture, the patient has complete duodenal obstruction due to unresectable tumor. If the definitive surgery is not feasible, we can place tube in the jejunum where we can adequately feed pre-digested food. or we can perform procedure to bypass the obstruction. So in here, we connect the stomach to the proximal jejunum to bypass the duodenal obstruction so the patient may resume oral feeding. This patient had perforated diverticulitis and the whole left side of the colon from distal transverse colon to sigmoid colon had been resected. The patient may have some problems with fermentation and stool formation and some issues with defecation, but the nutritional status of the patient will not be affected significantly. In fact, patients who underwent even complete removal of the entire colon, even rectum and anus, mostly ending up even with stoma, will have significant unfavorable effect to the nutritional status. Because the most vital part or step for oral or enteral nutrition is the absorption of nutrients, mainly in the small intestines, in which two factors play a major role. Nutrition may not be significantly affected with short segmental resection of small intestines. However, if the residual small intestines, although still long enough, is not healthy or has malabsorption problem, the nutrition of the patient may still be badly affected. Anatomically, even with massive small intestinal resection, as long as there is still more than 200 centimeters of residual healthy small bowels for nutrient absorption, or in some definitions, less than 50% of small bowels has been resected, this situation is well tolerated in terms of nutrition. The major problem is if the extent of small bowel resection is great enough, a devastating condition known as short bowel syndrome may result, which may cause significant problem with the nutritional aspect of the patient. And the last part of nutritional assessment is objective PE, which mainly seeks assess loss of muscle and adipose tissues, edema, organ dysfunction, and subtle changes in the skin, hair, or neurovascular function, reflecting frank or impending nutritional deficiency. Are there any questions at this point?
Okay, any questions?
None so far po, Doc.
Okay, let's continue.
The fundamental goal of nutritional support is to meet the energy requirements for essential metabolic processes and tissue repair, as failure to provide adequate non-protein energy sources will lead to consumption of clean tissue stores. The second objective is to meet the substrate requirements for protein synthesis. The requirements for energy is best measured by indirect calorimetry for hospitalized patients. However, in the critically ill patients where measurement of energy requirements is very important, the use of indirect calorimetry is labor intensive and often leads to overestimation of caloric requirements by 10 to 15%, particularly if they are receiving ventilatory support. A widely accepted method for calculating basal energy expenditure in healthy adults is the Harris-Benedict equations. These equations, adjusted for the type of surgical stress, are suitable for estimating the energy requirements in the majority of hospitalized patients. Alternatively, a simple weight-based equation of 25 to 30 kilocalories per kilogram per day using the usual body weight is appropriate and will adequately meet energy requirements in most post-surgical patients with a low risk of overfeeding. For example, a 70 kilogram healthy patient, we multiply by 25 to 30 kilocalories per kilogram per day, will need 1,750 to 2,100 kilocalories per day as caloric requirement. The caloric requirement for patients increases depending on the severity of stress. In patients who are healthy or with mild stress or even with moderate stress, provisions of up to 30 kilocalories per kilogram per day is already sufficient. These are the patients who are admitted in the hospital for several days for mild to moderate medical condition, or even patients who underwent uneventful, uncomplicated major surgical operations like surgery for thyroid, breast, hernia, gallbladder appendix, and other diseases not requiring prolonged hospitalization. For patients with severe stress, such as patients with major traumatic injuries, patients in the ICU, patients with sepsis, and patients who underwent difficult and complicated surgical course, particularly on cancer patients, the caloric requirement is increased up to 35 kilocalories per kilogram per day. The highest caloric adjustments above BEE is on patients who incurred major burn injuries. To qualify the burn injuries for our examination purposes, if the burn injuries is greater than 20% total body surface area, we will use up to 40 kilocalories per kilogram per day. The protein requirements provided after injury are usually 1.2 to even 2.5 times greater than calculated resting energy expenditure. And depending on the type of injury or stress, it is seldom appropriate to exceed this level of grams of protein per day during the height of the catabolic phase. An appropriate non-protein calorie nitrogen ratio of 150:1, meaning 1 gram of nitrogen equals 6.25 grams of protein. This should be maintained, which is the basal calorie requirement provided to limit the use of protein as an energy source. The ratio is 90:1 in patients with severe stress or massive burns. There are several components for adequate nutrition. Protein nutritional support is especially important for maintaining immune function and lean body mass, and is more closely linked to positive outcomes than total caloric intake. The mean protein requirement of healthy individuals is 0.8 to 1 gram per kilogram per day, but increases depending on the stress states as we had discussed a while ago. Carbohydrates are easily absorbed and metabolized. It is the main source of non-protein energy and are necessary to maintain protein anabolism. In general, they provide about 50% of total calories in standard enteral nutrition. Fats are a source of calories and essential fatty acids. Fat provides about 30% of total calories in standard enteral nutrition. The general recommendation is 1 gram per kilogram per day. Vitamins usually are not given in the absence of preoperative deficiencies, as the requirements for vitamins usually can be met in the average patient with an uncomplicated postoperative course. But we should be mindful in the diet of our patients because sometimes they are not included in the diet. Example are patients maintained on elemental diet or on parenteral hyperalimentation. It is necessary to ensure that adequate replacement is available in the diet or by supplementation to prevent development of vitamins and minerals deficiencies. Nutritional intervention is indicated prior to surgery only in severely malnourished patients with physiological impairment. Nutritional support is required in patients who cannot eat, in whom intake is insufficient for their needs, in whom the GIT cannot be used, and in those with accelerated doses. Malnourished patients always suffer a reduction in body cell mass. So in these patients, the energy expenditure calculation must be made using the actual weight. If the ideal body weight is used, there is risk of overestimating the caloric needs. In obese patients, a significant portion of weight gain is secondary to an expansion in fat mass, which is considered an inactive tissue. Therefore, in obese patients, energy expenditure calculation should be made using the ideal body weight to avoid overestimating calorie needs. Overfeeding usually results from overestimation of caloric needs, such as when indirect calorimetry is used, or may occur when actual body weight is used to calculate the BEE, such as in critically ill with significant fluid overload and obese patients. Overfeeding may contribute to clinical deterioration via increased oxygen consumption, increased carbon dioxide production, and prolonged need for ventilatory support, development of fatty liver, suppression of leukocyte function, hyperglycemia, and increased risk of infection. Are there any questions at this point?
Yes, sir. Apo, sir. Sige, sir. Iayusin ko ngayon. Okay pa. Thanks. Okay, any questions? Ito lang, highlight ko lang ito kasi gawa na yung exam nyo eh. You will be asked to compute for the caloric requirements of the patient. Hindi ito ang gagamitin nyo. Okay? Matotoxic kayo dyan. Ang exam nyo madali lang, so you can bring, you are not allowed to bring calculator. Pero yung exam nyo, exam ko lagi sa second year, madali lang para kapasa na kayo lahat. So, i-multiply nyo lang siya sa 30 yung weight. Okay? So, eto. If you will be given a case, so for example, 60 kilogram or 50 kilograms or 40 kilograms, you just multiply it by 25 to 30. And then anything in between that will be the required caloric requirement of the patient. Okay? So if you're given an 80 kilogram individual, the requirement will be somewhere between 80 times 25 to 80 times 30. So maliwanag yun?
Yes, Doc. Thank you po.
Dito sa table, if you will be given a case of a normal or patient with mild to moderate malnutrition, the required calories is at least 25 to 30 kilocalories per kilogram per day, even in patients with mild stress. So ang patient na may mild stress, ilalagay natin yung moderate stress sa patient na who will be undergoing major surgery. Okay? Uncomplicated major operation. So, ang mild stress, siguro mga mild stress, mga medical students, mga gano'n na lang ang mild stress para mas madali. And then, ang severe stress, pag nakita nyo sa qualifier, patients with severe or major trauma, incurred major trauma, patient is admitted in the ICU critically ill due to severe sepsis, complicated major abdominal operations or surgeries. So we will use 30 to 35. Okay? Usually 35. And then pag na-encounter nyo sa exam is major burn or severe burns, ang qualifier will be injury of 20% of more of the total body surface area. Kasi baka mamaya 1% lang naman or 5% lang naman ng body surface area. Hindi yun severe burns. Okay? So, pag ang nasa exam is 20% or more, we use 40. Pag ang nasa exam, 3%, 5%, baka 30, no? Pwede na dyan. Mild stress or moderate stress. Okay? So, ang severe stress, again, patient who was admitted in the ICU critically ill due to severe sepsis or sepsis, patient who incurred major abdominal injuries or trauma, patient who has complicated course of major abdominal operation. Now, this one, you just multiply it sometimes if binigay. Kasi ibang student, ang sabi nila, hindi naman siya lumabas stock eh. Wala siya sa slide. You multiply the weight. So if the weight is 70 kilos, so in patient with normal or mild or moderate malnutrition, it's 70 grams of protein per day, 70 times 1.0. So in patient with mild stress times 1.2 moderate. So for patient with severe stress, 70 times 2.0, that's 140 grams of protein per day. Okay? Any questions?
None so far po, Doc. Thank you po.
Continue natin.
Enteral versus parenteral nutrition. The dictum is, in circumstances when the gut is functional, enteral nutrition must be used. Enteral nutrition generally is preferred over parenteral nutrition based on the cost and the associated risk of the intravenous route, particularly vascular access complications. Studies comparing post-operative enteral and parenteral nutrition in patients undergoing gastrointestinal surgery have demonstrated reduced infectious complications in those fed by the enteral route. Of further consideration also are the consequences of GIT misuse. For healthy patients undergoing uncomplicated gastrointestinal surgery, there's no difference in outcome and complications between those who had enteral nutrition and those given maintenance intravenous fluids alone in the initial days after surgery. In fact, healthy patients can tolerate up to 10 days of partial starvation, meaning maintenance intravenous fluids only, before any clinically significant protein catabolism occurs. Initiation of enteral nutrition should occur immediately after adequate resuscitation in patients who underwent elective surgery, most readily determined by adequate urine output. The presence of bowel sounds and the passage of flatus or stool are not absolute prerequisites for initiation of enteral nutrition. And with the advent of minimally invasive surgery, where the duration of ileus is much, much shorter, majority of patients were able to start on diet immediately, recover fast, and return to work early. For critically ill or trauma patients, the data are more definitive as to the benefits of enteral nutrition compared with those receiving parenteral nutrition, particularly having a significant reduction in infectious complications. For ICU patients who are hemodynamically stable and have a functioning gastrointestinal tract, early enteral feeding within 24 to 48 hours of arrival in the intensive care unit, once adequate resuscitation has been achieved, has become a recommended standard of care. But the aim is providing caloric target below the actual energy expenditure, with the goal of providing more than 80% of estimated total energy goals gradually by 3 to 4 days. Earlier nutritional intervention is likely indicated for patients in whom preoperative protein calorie malnutrition has been identified. We need to upbuild the nutritional state of the patient to lessen surgical complications, especially for patients undergoing elective surgery. The functional status of the gastrointestinal tract determines the type of enteral solutions to be used. Patients with an intact gastrointestinal tract will tolerate complex solutions. But depending on the condition of the patient, for example, patients who have not been fed via the gastrointestinal tract for prolonged periods are less likely to tolerate complex carbohydrates. Several factors also influence the choice of enteral formula, such as the extent of organ, renal, pulmonary, hepatic, or GIT dysfunction, the nutrients needed to restore optimal function and healing, and the cost of the specific products. Other factors to consider include whether the enteral formula are GI tolerance promoting, anti-inflammatory, immune modulating, organ supportive, and standard enteral nutrition. So each doctor must use his or her own judgment about what formulas will best meet the patient needs. Standard polymeric formulas are considered to be the first-line formulas for stable patients with an intact gastrointestinal tract. It provides baseline carbohydrates, proteins, electrolytes, water, fat, and fat-soluble vitamins with about 1 to 2 kilocalories per ml caloric density. So approximately 1,500 to 1,800 ml, or about 4 to 6 glasses, are required to meet the daily requirements of our patients. Also, it leaves minimum residue because it does not contain fibers. For the succeeding slides, I am not promoting any products, nor I have any connections with any of the companies. I just post different products available so you will be familiar. Isotonic formulas with fiber contain soluble and insoluble fiber, which is most often soy-based. It is most beneficial in patients who have a high number of loose stools, as fiber-based solutions delay intestinal transit time and reduce the incidence of diarrhea compared with non-fiber solutions. Immune-enhancing formulas are fortified with immunonutrients that are claimed to enhance various aspects of immune or solid organ function. At present, the best studied immunonutrients are glutamine, arginine, and omega-3 fatty acids. Although several trials have proposed that one or more of these additives reduce complications, lower infectious risk, and improve outcome, these results have not been uniformly validated by other trials. Benefit may exist for individual or selected patients. The main difference of calorie-dense formulas is that it gives greater caloric value for the same volume as most commercial products available provide. It provides about 1.5 to 2 kilocalories per ml. This is best suitable for patients requiring fluid restriction or those unable to tolerate large volume infusions. High protein formulas are proposed for critically ill or trauma patients with high protein requirements. Also, there has been support for high protein, hypocaloric feeding in obese patients. That is why it is also termed as bariatric formulas. But as of this time, more data or stronger data is required for definitive recommendations. Elemental formulas contain pre-digested nutrients and provide proteins in the form of small peptides. Complex carbohydrates and fat content are minimal. The main advantage of elemental formulas is ease of absorption, but the inherent scarcity of fat, vitamins, and trace elements limits its long-term use as a primary source of nutrients. These formulas have been used frequently in patients with malabsorption, gut impairment, and pancreatitis, but their cost is significantly higher compared to standard formulas. The main advantages of renal formulas are lower fluid volume, and lower concentrations of potassium, phosphorus, and magnesium that are needed to meet daily requirements. This type of formulation almost exclusively contains essential amino acids and has a high non-protein calorie nitrogen ratio. However, it does not contain vitamins and trace minerals. In pulmonary failure formulas, fat content is usually increased to 50% of the total calories, with a corresponding reduction in carbohydrate content. The goal is to reduce carbon dioxide production and alleviate ventilation burden for failing lungs. The goal of hepatic failure formula is to reduce aromatic amino acid levels and increase the levels of branched-chain amino acids, which can potentially reverse encephalopathy in patients with hepatic failure. For patients who cannot be fed through the normal oral route, different access for enteral nutritional support is available. We can place NGT, nasoduodenal or nasojejunal tube, PEG, surgical gastrostomy, and jejunostomy. Just focus on these 5 enteral access. Nasoenteric tubes are for short-term use only. Nasogastric feeding is reserved for those with intact mentation and protective laryngeal reflexes to minimize the risk of aspiration. Both has aspiration risk, but much higher with NGT. Small bowel feeding is more reliable for delivering nutrition than nasogastric feeding. Nasojejunal feedings are associated with fewer pulmonary complications, including risk of pneumonia, but access past the pylorus requires greater effort to accomplish without the aid of fluoroscopy or endoscopy. The disadvantages of the use of nasoenteric feeding tubes are clogging, kinking, and inadvertent displacement or removal of the tube, and nasopharyngeal complications. If nasoenteric feeding will be required for longer than 30 days, it is recommended that the access should be converted to a percutaneous one. PEG is an invasive endoscopic procedure in which a flexible feeding tube is placed through the abdominal wall and into the stomach. Most tubes may be used for years. I usually replace the tube in the bedside or in the clinic at least every 3 to 6 months. PEG allows nutrition, fluids, or medications to be put directly into the stomach, bypassing the mouth and the esophagus. It is frequently used for debilitated patients requiring caloric supplementation, hydration, or frequent medication dosing. It is also appropriate for patients requiring passive gastric decompression. The most common indications for PEG include impaired swallowing mechanisms, oropharyngeal or partial esophageal obstruction, and major facial trauma. If PEG placement is not possible, surgical placement of tube can be considered. Also, for a patient undergoing complex abdominal or trauma surgery, thought should be given to the possible routes for subsequent nutritional support post-operatively, while there is still direct access to the stomach or small bowel as the abdomen is still open. Relative contraindications for gastrostomy placement, whether endoscopic or surgical, include ascites, coagulopathy, gastric varices, gastric neoplasm, and lack of a suitable abdominal site. The only absolute contraindication to tube feeding, particularly tube jejunostomy feeding, is distal intestinal obstruction. Relative contraindications include severe edema of the intestinal wall, radiation enteritis, IBD, ascites, severe immunodeficiency, and bowel skin. And this is the list of possible complications of tube gastrostomy and tube jejunostomy. Parenteral nutrition is the continuous infusion of a hypersmolar solution containing carbohydrates, proteins, fat, and other necessary nutrients for patients who cannot eat or absorb enough food through tube feeding formula or by mouth to maintain good nutritional status. The solutions usually are prepared in sterile conditions and given directly into the bloodstream through an indwelling catheter, preferably inserted into the subclavian vein, the internal jugular vein, and threaded into the superior vena cava. Or we can thread a long intravenous catheter through the basilic or cephalic vein into the superior vena cava. People can live well on parenteral nutrition for as long as it is needed. Many times, parenteral nutrition is used for a short time. Then it is lessened or discontinued when the person begins to switch to tube feeding or eat enough by mouth. Preoperative parenteral nutritional support may benefit some surgical patients, particularly those with extensive malnutrition. But postoperative use routinely of parenteral nutrition has not shown to have clinical benefit and may be associated with a significant increase in complication rate. The principal indications for parenteral nutrition are malnutrition, sepsis, or surgical or traumatic injury in seriously ill patients who are at high nutritional risk, for whom use of the GIT for feeding is not possible. The common indications include newborn infants with catastrophic gastrointestinal GIT anomalies, such as tracheoesophageal fistula, gastroschisis, omphalocele, or massive intestinal atresia. Infants who fail to thrive due to gastrointestinal insufficiency associated with malabsorption, enzyme deficiency, meconium ileus, or idiopathic diarrhea. Adult patients with short bowel syndrome secondary to massive small bowel resections, there is not enough length of small intestines left for nutrients absorption. Patients with high output intestinal fistulas, surgical patients with prolonged paratypic ileus after major surgery, or with reflex ileus complicating various medical diseases. Patients with normal bowel length but with severe malabsorption, or adult patients with functional GIT disorders and in whom major portions of the absorptive mucosa are diseased. Patients with malignancy, with or without cachexia, in whom malnutrition might jeopardize successful use of a therapeutic option. In cancer patients, delivery of parenteral nutrition, if enteral nutrition is feasible, has not been shown to benefit clinical response, prolong survival, or ameliorate the toxic effects of chemotherapy, but infectious complications are increased. Patients in whom attempt to provide adequate calories by enteral tube feedings have failed, and in critically ill patients who are hypermetabolic for more than 5 days, or for whom enteral nutrition is not feasible. Patients in whom TPN is contraindicated include the following: patients with good nutritional status, patients for whom GIT feeding is feasible. In the vast majority of instances, this is the best route by which to provide nutrition. Patients experiencing hemodynamic instability or severe metabolic derangement requiring control or correction before hypertonic intravenous feeding is attempted. Patient for whom dying is inevitable. TPN, also referred to as central parenteral nutrition, requires access to a large diameter vein to deliver the entire nutritional requirements. The dextrose content of the solution is high, about 15% to 25%. The lower osmolarity of the solution used for peripheral parenteral nutrition, or PPN, secondary to reduced levels of dextrose and protein, allow its administration via peripheral veins. However, some nutrients cannot be provided because they cannot be concentrated in small volumes. Therefore, PPN is not appropriate for patients with severe malnutrition. PPN is used for short periods, usually less than 2 weeks. Beyond this time, PPN should be instituted. Intravenous vitamin preparations, as well as essential trace minerals, should be supplemented as it is not incorporated to parenteral nutrition to prevent development of vitamin and trace mineral deficiencies after prolonged TPN use. One of the more common and serious complications associated with long-term parenteral feeding is sepsis, usually secondary to contamination of the central venous catheter or contamination of the solution itself. Other technical complications related to catheter placement may also occur. The urine or capillary blood glucose level is checked every 6 hours, and serum glucose concentrations checked at least once daily during the first few days of the infusion and at frequent intervals thereafter. As hyperglycemia may develop with normal rates of infusion in patients with impaired glucose tolerance, or in any patient if the hypertonic solutions are administered too rapidly. A significant shift of potassium ion from the extracellular to the intracellular space may take place because of the large glucose infusion, with resultant hypokalemia, metabolic alkalosis, and poor glucose utilization. Hypokalemia may cause glycosuria, which must be treated with potassium, not insulin. Therefore, before giving insulin, the serum potassium level must be checked to avoid exacerbating the hypokalemia. Also, the patient should be carefully monitored for development of any electrolyte, volume, or acid-base disturbances. In conclusions, to maintain basal metabolic needs, particularly during fasting or at rest, approximately 25 to 30 kilocalories per kilogram per day, drawn for carbohydrate, lipid, and protein sources, is required for normal healthy adult. If the patient will be subjected to stress such as injury, surgery, or sepsis, the magnitude of metabolic expenditure over time appears to be directly proportional to the severity of insult. The first critical step in providing appropriate nutrition therapy is to perform nutritional screening and nutritional assessment to identify those patients at risk for nutritional problems. Hence, we may be able to reduce complications, treatment failures, physiological problems associated with malnutrition, as well as lower the hospitalization costs. Enteral versus parenteral nutrition. The dictum is, in circumstances when the gut is functional, enteral nutrition must be used. Are there any questions?
Okay, any questions?
None so far, Doc.
Meron pala nito, sorry. I made a post-lecture evaluation. For this one, sagutan nyo lang sa sarili nyo, no? Tingnan nyo kung meron kayong na-retain. And usually, halos ganito lang din naman ang exam. Kaya lang humirap yung exam nyo, eh. Akala ko wala kasi tayong, humirap ng konti. Akala ko wala kasi tayong makeup. So, nag-depend ako purely sa PowerPoint. Pero, kaya nyo naman yun. Nasubmit na kasi eh. And then, Dr. Mendoza informed me last Wednesday yata ng hapon or kahapon that we're going to have makeup pa. So anyway, so this is an example. Number 1, which of the following conditions has the highest energy demands? Letter A, sepsis. B, major GIT surgery. C, major burn injuries. And then letter D, severe traumatic injuries. So the answer is letter C, major burn injuries, patient incurring, yan ang gagamitin natin, 20% or more of the total body surface area. So we will consider this as severe, no? Severe. Requiring 30 to 35. This one will be 35 to 40. What is the caloric requirements in kilocalories per kilogram per day of adult patients with malnutrition who will undergo thyroidectomy for thyroid cancer? So we will consider this as major surgery. Sasabi natin, it will be labeled as moderate stress. Pero hindi kayo mamamali kasi normal, mild, moderate, or even mild and moderate malnutrition, usually 30 siya. Okay? So ito lang ang tatandaan nyo, yung naiiwan na 30 to 35 at saka yung burn na 35 to 40. So the answer is 25 to 30 or 30. What is the caloric requirement in kilocalories per day of a ilang weight nito? 60 kilogram adult patient who was admitted in the ICU due to major burn injuries of about 30% TBSA. So 30 times 40, mali. 60 times 40, 2,400 kilocalories per day. Okay. Number 3, which of the following formulas has the main advantage of ease of absorption as it contains pre-digested nutrients and it's the best formulas for patients with malabsorption and gut impairment? Standard polymeric, bariatric, elemental, calorie dense. So the answer is elemental. And what is the most common technical complication associated with parenteral nutrition? So the answer is sepsis due to catheter-related infection. So all of these are technical complications, but this is the most common. So, ganun lang. Okay sa inyo yan, Pauline?
Yes po, Doc. Thank you po.
So okay na siguro. This is just a makeup class naman eh. Meron pa bang any questions or any concerns? Okay na tayo?
Yes po, Doc.
Okay. So kung wala na, thank you everyone for attending. See you sa